All right, great to be with you all today. I'm really excited about today's webinar. We actually had a fantastic response to what we're presenting today, so thank you for joining us. So today's presentation is on our social network analysis, which will be introduced in a little bit by Jenny Lawler. I'm Laura Calandrella. I'm the Executive Director of Keeping Forest, for those of you who I haven't met before. And today, talking about the social network analysis is really talking about the power of partnership and the power of collaboration. And Keeping Forest decided to do a social network analysis, largely one, to measure the value of collaboration. We all know that collaboration is valuable, but how is it valuable? And how do we actually use those network relationships to do something meaningful and create impact? And so that is why I reached out to Visible Network Labs, to Danielle and Jenny, to really help us start to make the invisible visible and to have some data to actually do something with it, not just for Keeping Forest, but for our community at large. Jenny, will you switch to the next slide, please? So before I start, I just want to say a huge thank you to our sponsors for the U.S. Forest Service, who has supported Keeping Forest from the very beginning, both financially, excuse me, financially, and also just with their opening of their network and their network connections. Southern Group of State Foresters and Texas A&M Forest Service have also been huge supports, as they are our fiscal sponsors. So really are also doing matching contributions, but helping us to get all of the nuts and bolts of running an NGO going. So thank you to all three of you. And then also to all of our partners that did take the time to participate in this analysis. We could not have the data that we have today without your participation. And I think it's just going to really start to blow open a lot of possibilities for the Southern Forest Conservation Network at large. So thank you all. And for the rest of you for being here today to learn from it. Next slide, please. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Keeping Forest, or just to bring everybody to the same page, Keeping Forest really started with the Southern Forest futures, right? That's the 2010. The Southern Forest Outlook is coming on board right now. So I'm confusing the two, but the Southern Forest Outlook, which is a 10-year report from the Forest Service that projected that we will have 23 million acres of forest loss in the South by 2060. And so partners came together to really understand what could we do about that as a community and what was the most important focus over many years of really trying to understand and align and think about long-term strategy. Where Keeping Forest has landed is a focus on private landowners and how do we catalyze, promote, expand markets for forest landowners who own 86% of the land in the South, the forest land in the South. And so our work largely focuses on market-driven forest conservation and also building awareness for what the importance is of working forest land in the South. Next slide, please. So this is our vision, our mission, our partnership values. I've already talked a little bit about these. You are welcome to read through these. And I also just want to share with you that we will be sharing these slides. What I really want to highlight here is that everything that you are about to see today and everything that you do see from Keeping Forest has been partnership driven and collaboratively driven. So there's been no wizard behind the screen trying to create a strategy and then get people to join. We have all, as a partnership, and people have floated in and out, which is part of what it means to be a partnership and a network, to really inform the strategies that you'll see today and you'll see going forward. Also, what makes this unique, besides the fact that we are a market-driven forest conservation effort, is that we're looking at a system scale. So Keeping Forest looks at the 13-state geography that represents the U.S. South and is parallel to the U.S. Forest Service Southern region. So we're talking about Virginia all the way to Oklahoma, down to East Texas, and sweep all of the states in between. So when we're talking about that geography, when we're talking about the U.S. South and Southern Forest, that's the geography we're talking about. So we really want to impact the entire system. We're looking at how do we change a 13-state geography, markets within a 13-state geography, ecology, demographics, geography. We're not focused on politics, but even the policies that influence those 13 states. So we're looking at the entire system. And then innovation. We really want to come in and do things that aren't being tested anywhere else and that no single entity or organization could or would do. We're taking the risk on the edges of what might be possible for driving markets for Southern forests in the South moving forward. Next slide, please. So how are we, or what do we do? our role in this network is to convene, to innovate, and to scale. And so that was actually something that we asked people, how are we doing with that as an organization? But convening, we serve as a broad multi-sector partnership to bring people together around common issues and a common vision for ensuring the future for Southern Forests. I've already spoken a little bit about innovation. So everything that we're doing really looks at things through a different lens. And then scaling, anything that we do has to be scalable and replicable. And in the last year, we've actually launched some initiatives that are pilot projects that are locally based. And yet everything that we're testing there has to be something that's replicable and scalable. So we're really interested in finding the solutions that can be applied anywhere within the South, and then perhaps even in the nation, or even globally, depending on the other characteristics of solutions that are needed in other parts of the world. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? Our three strategies, which were informed again by a partnership-driven effort, we looked across the Southeast at all of the interplay between what was happening that was affecting forest landowners and Southern forest markets. We landed on promoting and expanding markets for Southern forest products, catalyzing opportunities to compensate Southern landowners for ecosystem services. Specifically, we're focused on water, and then ensuring that there is a network of individuals, champions, and leaders, influential people who can talk about working forests, but from the lens of one of our forest values. So when we talk about these champions and leaders, they have their own constituencies, which might not have anything to do with working forests, but they have their lens about why it's important, for example, biodiversity or recreation or human health, and they can really serve to be a voice about working forest in a different way. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny and to Danielle. I do want to say, because we want to make this as interactive as possible, please use the chat to introduce yourself to one another, who you are, your organization, where you're coming to us from today. But then if there are questions and answers, there's a specific question and answer section within the chat function, so that I'm not having to monitor everything and pull those questions and answers out. And we'll stop periodically to engage in those questions and answers. I will also say, unfortunately, I do not have a tech person like I had last year. And so I'm going to be testing some polls. I'm going to make sure if they're not interruptive to the presentation as a whole, I'm going to be using those polls to get some input from you all, and I encourage you to participate in them. So with that, I do want to introduce Jenny's on screen right now. I think Danielle will be joining us a little bit later, but Jenny is the Director of Data Science and Insights. She's a community psychologist with expertise in network and system science, community change efforts, and the use of research science. What makes Visible Network Labs really special, and why we reached out to them, is because they do take the network analysis and they put it into a format that all of us can use. They have a software platform called Partner. We'll introduce you to that a little bit later, but this is really making things come to life in a way that is that's usable, adaptable, changeable, and that we can build on into the future. When Danielle comes on, I will introduce her, but for all of you to know that she is the founder and CEO of Visible Network Labs, and she started this after some RAND policy research really helped her to see insights into the healthcare sector and how data might help to visualize, track, and understand networks so that they can achieve their full potential. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Jenny.
Great, thanks so much, Laura. Thank you for that kind introduction. So Laura asked me to kind of just get us started by talking a little bit about network science and network analysis, and just what this is, why do we care about it? And I want to start with what I hope is not too radical of an idea, but it's this concept that all of us already are network scientists. There isn't something about this that is terribly unusual or outside of our experiences. And I can give you a good example of that. And it's COVID-19, right? All of us overnight had to start thinking about what our network strategy would be, right? Who would we connect to? What would be the costs and benefits of our relationships, right? And what situations might we increase our risks? How can we develop closed networks that are still efficient, that still meet our social and emotional and health needs? And what might be the risk of expanding our network, and when is it worth the rewards, right? So all of us think about this at the very least at an interpersonal level, but I think we also use it very often in professional situations, right? We think about it all the time when we do things like build networks for our for the kind of work that we do. We think about how do we bring the right people together to address complex problems. We think about how to identify people that have needed resources or relationships or capacities to be able to mobilize for action and to have what we need to do that. We also evaluate our collaborative activities, right, to try to see what has the most impact, what types of partnerships help us to accomplish our goals. And we also very often use networks to do things like get the word out, to share new tools or information, to make sure that new practices are available to people who might be able to use them. So really, all of us are using network science all the time. And what I want to propose really is that when we start adding in data, we start building on insights that have come from people who are studying this and really digging into this work, that we can actually take that to a new level, right? We can get evidence and data that helps to really inform our decision making and move to action more effectively. We can avoid this trap of feeling like more is better, right? Often when we don't have a clear strategy and we don't have clear data, we just think, oh, we need to do more networking, get more people to the table. But when we start really pulling in data, thinking more strategically, we can really focus on what are the relationships that we already have, the resources that are available to us already. How do we make the most of those and avoid burnout and overworking the people who are already so engaged in the work that we do? And to do that, we can build a data-informed strategy, and we can use the tools of research to really evaluate and improve on our collaborative activities over time. So I think network science is just great. But we're gonna, in today's presentation and throughout the webinar, you'll see lots of these network maps. So I wanted to just quickly orient us to what we're seeing and the language that we use to describe it. So what we have are the building blocks of a network. There's really only two components that you have to understand. One is the nodes, and in this case, the nodes represent organizations in the Keeping Forests network. So each dot in this image represents one organization, and then these lines that connect them, we call those ties, which reflect the relationships among those organizations. And those relationships can be characterized by the types of activities that they involve, things like information sharing, referring to each other or doing different types of collaborative activities. And we'll dig into that a little bit later. But those are the basic building blocks. And once you understand that, everything kind of flows from there. And then we can kind of dig into our network structure and all the different components of it. But as sort of an example, this is the Keeping Forests network. This is what came directly out of our analysis that we did together. We had 68 organizations. Those are our nodes with 1,004 relationships among them. So it's a pretty active network. And it has about a 22% density, meaning of all possible relationships, 22% of them were observed in the network. And in the world of network science, that's actually pretty high. It's pretty rare in a social network to see more than about 25% density there. So this is it's an active and involved network. And on average, members reported having about between 14 and 15 relationships. So pretty cool. And we're going to dig into this as we kind of go along. But one other kind of key background piece that I want to highlight is this concept of understanding the important roles that different nodes play in a network. And from network science, there are kind of three major role types that often come up as being really, really useful for this type of work. One is our influencers, and those are the people or organizations that just have direct connections to a large number of others. So we'll see in the network, those are, people who, if you think of social media, they have a lot of followers, but in this case, they might just be well connected. People know them well. We have brokers. They often kind of sit between different members of the network. So you can imagine, they can be helpful for connecting groups that might otherwise be disconnected. They can serve as facilitators, or they could gatekeep within a network. And then we have information exchangers. And those are people who, they have very few degrees of separation between themselves and others in the network. So they can really help with getting the word out, moving, new practices or new information through the network. And this is going to come back later on. We're going to show some of these, what we found from the Keeping Forests network about this. So I wanted to just highlight that to get us started. And I think I'll pause here because I think Laura wanted to talk a little bit about kind of how did we get here? How did we set up the network? And what was the process for this?
Yes, absolutely. And just so you all know, the chat is live now. I did get that solved while Jenny was getting us started. So they call this in the network science world bounding the network. So when we came to Jenny and Danielle, we said, okay, we want to do this. And there's this giant network that is Southern Forest Conservation and Southern Forest Products. And so we had to choose, though, something that was manageable to start with. So we ended up choosing 80, I think 80 organizations to reach out to. And the way that we did that essentially was to go back through all of the meetings and all of the 5 years of participation that we had seen within our network, and just started there. Where were the partners that were most involved in our network, but also or had come in and we felt like they were influential at a particular point. We also looked a little bit outside of just the people that were most involved to be thinking about who do we know about that has some level of involvement in the larger Southern Forest Conservation community, that we would like to see what they're thinking, where they're connected to, if they're connected to any of our partners. So this was a really, really difficult process to actually to do this. And I want to say a couple of things. One is that we did ask at the end of everybody's response analysis, who did we miss? So we do have that data, and we do know who our community members are saying these are the people that are also in the network. Second of all, this is the first iteration of something that will continue to live and breathe and grow over the course of keeping forest life. So I do believe that it's important too that we note, and they're going to talk about this a little bit later on. For example, instead of asking every single state forestry agency to respond, we asked a Southern group of state foresters to respond as proxy for all of those organizations. We are a regional effort, and so we tried to keep the data confined enough that we could really see what was going on without having an outlier of 13 state forestry organizations having an outsized impact on what we were seeing within the network. Similarly with things like the Forest Service or TNC, we were asking really targeted pieces of the organization to stand in for a larger network. And I do want to just make a mention that Danielle has joined us. I don't see her on video, but we'll take a moment, maybe Jenny, when there's a natural stopping point, to introduce her as well.
Good. Well, maybe now is a good moment. We can pull Danielle in, and we can talk a little bit also about the just how we think about bounding and all of that and impact. So welcome, Danielle. Thanks for joining.
Hi.
Here, let me stop sharing for a minute so we can all see each other. So glad to have you. And Danielle is our CEO and founder and fearless leader, and also just a true expert in networks. So is there anything else that you want to add, Danielle?
Most anticipated video reveal I think I've ever had. So thank you. It's so good to be here. And we've just been so pleased to work with Keeping Forests. And I am the CEO and founder of Visible Network Labs, and have roots in working with the RAND Corporation and at the University of Colorado, but always translating network science and data into action steps and strategies for community. So like Jenny, I have a real passion for that. So glad to have her. But this has been a great partnership. And I think what Laura was just talking about was something that we really admired about being able to work with a really strong network leader who could really try to think like, how do we actually bound a list of a huge ecosystem that might represent enough response so that we could get started and we could really deeply understand some of the connections here. So looking forward to the rest of the presentation. Jenny, I'll hand it back over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Danielle. All right. And yeah, I think Laura really kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of kind of what we like to think about when we're doing these analyses, where, we know there are lots of different actors involved, and we try to figure out how can we kind of capture the most complete picture of the network, recognizing that, we want to be realistic. We want to not be tapping tons of people who we know are all really busy doing this good work. And so I think we hit a really great balance on this that kind of sets up for future work as well, to keep kind of exploring exploring this network, understanding kind of as we go further out what else is, what other activities and impacts are happening. But I want to just first talk a little bit about kind of setting the context here and just characterizing who we did have in the network at this round and what kind of experiences they reported having. So we had a pretty interesting breakdown of different types of organizations and a wide range of service geographies among the organizations. So we saw, kind of the plurality of orgs were nonprofits, but we did have a number from the private sector and federal organizations, as well as kind of a nice breakdown, including private landowners, foundations, state level organizations, and some academic organizations as well. So kind of a nice, interesting representation there across the ecosystem that is kind of doing this work. And then in terms of geography, we saw really a wide range covering kind of all of the southern United States, as well as Puerto Rico and some international and kind of broadly national serving organizations as well. So that just gives a kind of high level sense of who was in the network, who participated in this analysis. We also asked each of them, as they kind of talked about their network, to help us understand what types of activities they do with their partners. And we saw a few that really kind of rose to the top here, although folks were doing activities kind of across the gamut, but the most common activities often involved kind of network building work, like exchanging information, convening, coordinating and communicating messaging and marketing. We also saw lots of advocacy activities. So often a lot of those types of activities tend to be associated with networks that are kind of in development or, building themselves up. Often you have to spend a lot of time kind of in that space early on so that you can have that kind of groundwork to be able to move towards those really high impact activities that networks are able to do once everyone kind of knows each other and gets onto the same page. We also asked them to talk about what issues they focused on in their relationships. And again, we saw quite a few kind of a nice range of activities related to Southern forest conservation. Most commonly, we heard folks saying that they were working on issues related to biodiversity. But we also saw almost half of members talking about fiber and rural economies as well. Things that showed up a little bit less frequently were things like health and recreation. So that's kind of an interesting point to think about as we kind of move ahead to see if there maybe are any other ways that we want to engage those types of activities or issues. And then finally, we also asked some questions about the outcomes of the relationship. So, what benefits or value come from the relationships that members have in this network? And again, what we saw here was fairly consistent with the observation that a lot of the activities were affiliated with sort of network building. We saw at the very top that lots of folks talked about their relationships as being informative and supporting information exchange, but also 42% mentioned that they were able to connect to new partners that they hadn't worked with before. So that was, just having these relationships within this Southern Forest Conservation Network helped to continue building their network. And also members mentioned that they were increasing trust. So about a third of the members saw an increase in trust as a result of their relationships. So overall, that kind of speaks to critical and beneficial development activities that kind of help, again, to set a network up. But some of those that maybe are more substantive, we see a little bit lower here, including things like efficiency increasing and scaling or developing new programs. And again, that's fairly normal as networks kind of continue building up these things like trust and information sharing, then they often build capacity to do some of those other substantive activities as well.
Yeah, and Jenny, I was actually going to pop in to ask that exact question of how common is this? What are stages of growth of a network where you start to see some of that shift to capacity building beyond just developing relationships? What needs to happen? If you could just give us a little bit more insight about, or Danielle as well, how networks grow and become different and that their emphasis on capacity building or outcomes changes.
Yeah, so we often see new networks have a life cycle just like everything else. And we often see kind of early on that there's kind of a lot of growth. building up the network, bringing in new partners, kind of building often lots of relationships, right? And then as the network kind of refines itself over time, we see some of those relationships tend to get refined themselves, right? And we see a little bit more focus. Sometimes the network, you start to see some clusters, right? Where groups are starting to focus in on specific activities. And I think that's where once we start having a little bit more kind of intentionality among members about working with partners who are sharing their interests, who are working on shared problems, that's where they start being able to take a little more action. They start kind of organizing themselves. And that, I think that's where you often see kind of a little bit more room for working on those substantive issues, building capacity, things like that. Danielle, is there anything you would add to that?
Well, I would, and I think it's a really exciting time for Keeping Forest too, kind of watching it go through those life cycles. And one thing that we try to help folks think about is how kind of exhausting it can be to always be told we have to do more networking and more collaboration. So there really is a point where it's like we have to build those connections and knowledge of each other. But there comes a point when we might want to think about efficiencies. How do we maintain the same collaborative advantage with fewer connections, fewer meetings, actually fewer asks of each other, because we have built trust and knowledge of each other and kind of an understanding of what the benefit is of working together. So what we see as a sustainable tactic over time is that a network begins to build really intentional network strategies about how they want to work together, maybe dividing up who does what, decentralizing leadership is a key component of making sure there's a sustainable nature of it, and kind of only asking people to participate when they are going to be needed or their expertise is needed, and then otherwise making it optional. And so as Keeping Forest moves through some of these stages, it seems really natural that we'd actually expect there to be a little bit of less activity, although maintaining the same kind of outcome. So something to look forward to that hopefully helps us keep things going without always needing to invest more and more and more.
Yeah, thank you. And I that really, I think, is the point where we're at. Like we haven't had these continuous working groups and having to pull people together every 2 weeks to really think about things. We have our strategies in place, and there are some specific opportunities that we have for people to engage, and I'll talk more about that later. But I think also just for those that are on the phone, understanding the life cycle of a collaboration. There's a lot of people on the webinar today who are part of a collaboration or are leaders of a collaboration. And I think it's just, I think the amount of time that it takes to get to capacity building is important to emphasize for those that are in those roles. So thank you.
And then one additional question that we asked in the survey was really about just the familiarity that these members had with Keeping Forest strategies and with the mission, to kind of get a sense for just where everyone is in terms of their awareness. And we saw overwhelmingly that respondents have some awareness of the mission and strategies of Keeping Forest. So 86% of the respondents either said they had a fair amount or a great deal of awareness. So that really sets kind of a nice baseline infrastructure for kind of continuing to build this relationship as a group. And I see Laura just posted a poll about that, so everyone can jump in and weigh in on that as well. Is there anything else you wanted to say about the strategies, Laura?
No, I think they're in development, and I think that they're shifting a lot right now. And so I'm going to also include some links and follow up about where those strategies are. A couple newsletters ago, I did sort of put out our roadmap for the next couple of years so people can see. But I guess I would also say that these only move forward with participation and engagement from our partners. So I was really happy to see this. I'll say that. I was really glad to see that people know what's going on with Keeping Forest and that we're communicating that enough and effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also brings us into talking more about kind of those key roles that organizations play in networks like this, especially because we saw that Keeping Forest plays a pretty key role in this network. So we did, again, kind of revisiting that concept from earlier about those different types of roles. We pulled out each of those kind of three that I mentioned to try and understand a little bit more in the context of this network who kind of occupies critical roles and maybe putting them in positions where they can serve as leaders or support the network in different kinds of ways. So starting with those network influencers, which are those people or organizations that have just a direct connection to lots of others in the network. I think unsurprisingly, we saw a lot of these like larger and some of them federal organizations that are involved with forestry. So things like the USDA Forest Service, the Southern Group of State Foresters, NCSU, CNR, and the U.S. Endowment for Forests and Communities, as well as the National Alliance of Forest Owners. So those are folks that just generally, they have lots of connections. So you could think of them as sort of they're our influencers, right? They have the ability to kind of connect to lots of different people in the network. And then we have our brokers who, again, are those members that sit kind of in between other organizations. So we think about the number of degrees of separation between different members of the network, right? If we went from one organization to another, these are organizations that would often sit on that pathway between them. And so this is where we start to see the kind of impact that Keeping Forests has and the power that they have in this network, in the sense that they are kind of a key broker. But again, we also see kind of those expected large players like the Forest Service and the U.S. Endowment for Forests and Communities, Southern Group of State Foresters, and again, NAFO as well. And then we have our information exchangers. Those are the ones that have really very few degrees of separation to others in the network. And just to highlight again, Keeping Forests is, right at the top of this one in terms of their role in the network. So they're, again, kind of a key player in terms of getting that information out. But, we also see like Southern Regional Extension in there. Again, the Forest Service and the Southern Group of State Foresters and CSU as well.
Can I pause just for a second before you go to the next slide? Because I think this was sort of an aha moment for us within Keeping Forests as we were understanding the data. So first of all, it's really important to point out that the way that this analysis was done is we asked all of these organizations not to just talk about the relationship to Keeping Forests, although that was a piece of it. We asked them to talk about the relationship to one another. So when these top 5 are coming out, these are those 68 organizations that have responded, answering questions about the 80 organizations that we outreach to. So Keeping Forests, we've defined the network, right, based on what are the work that we're doing, but this is also, we're a member of the network. So we're one of you, right, as we think about this. And that was an aha moment for me, because I was trying to think to myself, is this data skewed because we chose who to engage in the analysis? And maybe Danielle or Jenny, you could say something about that, as well as being a member and also it's really the Keeping Forest network.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does say something here that, when we look at these really large players that appeared at the top, that Keeping Forests is also kind of showing up in that space. And, each of these metrics is defined not just by each, for example, Keeping Forests identifying their partners, but it's also how all these other members of the network think about Keeping Forests and every other member of the network, right? Everybody has the chance to identify their partnerships and respond to it. And so I think it does really say something important to see kind of the role that Keeping Forests is playing here, because they're also sort of being nominated by others in the network, and that situates them where they are in this position. And it's often something that we see that, even when we have a smaller organization that occupies a leadership role that really is doing the work to convene that, it's often reassuring to see them, at these showing up in these metrics as kind of key players in the network. I think it reinforces the work that's being done. And certainly as we do, dig deeper into this work, or we look further out, we can kind of continue to refine and tell that story some more. But I think, it's important to remember that there was, Laura, as you said, a pretty rigorous process of really evaluating who should be included and trying to get that nice spread. So I wouldn't write any of that off at all. I think, yeah, certainly there's some validity to what we're seeing here.
Thank you.
And I want to just highlight one other kind of interesting kind of finding that we saw here, that I think is again kind of promising for the direction the network is going in, which is there were a few kind of key activities that Keeping Forests has been focusing on. One being kind of convening the right partners, getting the right people at the table, which again sort of aligns with that kind of network development focus, and as well as kind of these other more substantive efforts like increasing innovation and creating scalable solutions. And so this just gives you a snapshot of where the network was at the time we finished this data collection. So at the end of last year, where we had about 50% of the partnerships involved some kind of convening activities among them. So those are members saying, you know, I work with my partners on this activity. About 30% talked about doing work that was focused on increasing innovation, and about 20% were working on creating scalable solutions. So certainly even at this stage of the game, we see quite a bit of work being done that kind of highlights each of these activities in the network. And you know, it'll be super interesting as the work continues to develop to track kind of the movement of these activities, and also kind of engagement among members. You can kind of see in these 3 different maps of the network that, you know, certainly convening is often that's a little bit of an easier activity, and we see that there are no isolated nodes. Everybody is connected to that network and everyone is involved in some way in doing that. Whereas when we get into innovation and scaling, there are some organizations here that are not yet connected, that may not have a role in that yet. And so, you know, that can be a point to kind of think about, you know, are we engaging the right people or the right organizations? And are there opportunities to, you know, make sure that the right folks are connected to each other to kind of take most advantage of that scaling effort?
And Jenny, there's a question that relates to the slides above as well. So the question is really framing the idea that those people who are the key players are closest to a bridger organization, Feet in Mini World. So they could see the information exchangers as being somewhat of a bridger as well, but bringing in outlier groups into the fray. And so does that question make enough sense for you to answer, or do we want to ask Mark to clarify a bit?
Which one comes closest? Oh, I see. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And the reality is that, you know, we often see many of those organizations that are high in each of those different types of what we call centrality, that you see them appear in more than one space, right? Because it's like that structural position often kind of carries over among them. So yeah, it can be helpful to think about both, like folks that are in an information exchanging position may be able to like reach groups that even somebody in a brokering position might not, because of their position in the network. So I think it always helps in any situation where you're trying to like take a new action with a network to really look at, you know, who are those players that are situated in different places and who is most likely to be able to help reach the groups that you want to reach. And sometimes that can be, you know, there's an influencer that has those direct connections to everybody that's really critical, but sometimes, you know, they might be missing like an important group that's not yet connected, right? And so then we want to find who is the right either broker, bridger, or an information exchanger that might have, you know, a way to get access to that group. So certainly these aren't necessarily like totally written in stone in terms of, you know, this one is for this specific purpose, but these are kind of roles that just generally help us to start thinking a little bit more strategically about how we can engage and mobilize the network. And I think that's another, you know, for members of the network or folks that are thinking about being part of the Keeping Forests network, you know, there's always that kind of open question of how do you want to be engaged? And I hope this gives some ideas as well about different ways that we might approach this work, and the different, like just even looking at this, the different activities that are already happening in the network where there might be opportunities to be connecting and continuing to build the impact that this work is having.
Yeah, and we just opened a poll for people to say, okay, what do you see your role as in this network? But I think also just helping people to take this one step further in their own networks as they're doing network building, to really understand the value of all 3 of these roles, right? That we do need all 3 of these roles to be able to achieve our strategies. And U2 Visible Network Labs is really aligned with my thinking on partnership building, is that we don't need everybody doing everything, right? And the more that we can get to decentralized leadership and leverage the resources that are out there so that we're not being duplicative, that becomes really important. And so as I'm asking the question and just seeing the results come through, I'll share the results of this poll for people to see. I think it's a lot about seeing, you know, okay, where do you fit in either influencer, broker, or exchanger, right? And then how do you connect to those other pieces of the, if you're not an influencer, how do you connect to brokers or exchangers? So I found that particularly interesting as well.
Great. I'm going to take us into one more kind of direction here to talk a little bit about trust and value in the network. These are two things that just historically we found are really critical for a successful network. And Danielle has done a ton of work in this, so I hope you jump in with ideas or thoughts about this as well. But we really break this up into these two concepts of trust and value that come from the relationships that members have in a network. And when it comes to actually evaluating this in our analysis, we used 3 questions. They don't include either the word trust or the word value. We just have these 3 questions for each. For trust, we break it up into these concepts that come from the literature and come from previous work in this area that kind of identified trust as really being composed of this sense of reliability in terms of the partners we have, that they follow through on their commitments. They're somebody you can really see as reliable. That they have a shared mission, and that they support it, and that they're open to discussion and willing to kind of engage frankly and in civil ways. And we saw that trust is really a big asset in this network. So we ask each of these questions on a 4-point scale, and where we see kind of 3 as our kind of most positive, or kind of that point where we see the best results. And across each of these domains of trust, we saw that this network was kind of on average showed up above each of them, above that benchmark. So that puts us in, I think, a really good place. That's a nice foundation. Everything else kind of can flow from starting from a point of trust in a network. When you don't have that, it can be really hard to build up the other components. And then we also have the perceived value, and that's how each member of the network perceives the value in the relationships they have. So again, they rate each of their partners on 3 questions. In this case, we break it up into power and influence, which is how much they perceive in their partners as having the ability to be influential or powerful in the network. We have level of involvement there. So organizations that are kind of strongly committed and they're active in the network would be higher on this one. And then resource contributions. So each member rates their partners in terms of how much they perceive that their partners are contributing resources to the work. So that it could include things like funding, but also it could be just information sharing, sharing tools, resources like measurement tools, all kinds of different types of resources. And again, what we often see with networks that are kind of building themselves up is that the value scores tend to be just a little bit lower, because it takes some time to actually build up all of these types of things, right? Everyone's not at a high level of involvement from day one. They might not yet know what resources they want to contribute or how they want to contribute them. So again, this I think shows a lot of promise in the network, that these scores, they're all fairly high. We're not far away from that benchmark of 3, but we're just not quite there yet. And so often networks will focus on kind of improving those values. First, of course, building on that nice foundation of trust. So knowing that they have that trust in each other allows us to kind of convene and think about, how can we effectively mobilize the resources that we have. And I think, Laura, you're going to talk about the resources a little bit, but also like thinking, from a leadership perspective, how can we identify members that want to be involved, and helping them find the right opportunities to get involved in the best way for them. And of course, building that power and influence through building things like distributed leadership in the network. So those all kind of set us up really well for that. And I'll pause there because maybe this is a good moment to switch over to you, Laura.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And I will say that each of the member organization or the partners that participated in the analysis did receive their own member profile. So as part of that member profile, they have received their individual trust and value scores, as well as a host of other information. And I think you guys have mentioned, like, this can be really great stuff to share in your annual report. Think about how do you align your own strategies. You want to say anything more about, for those organizations that have their own individual member profile, what can they do with that?
Go
I can
ahead.
talk about it a little bit. We created those member profiles originally kind of as a thank you back to folks because we were getting a lot of requests, or we ask people to answer surveys, and we know that people are interested in, when I answer a survey, it often just goes into a black hole, and then we don't know what happened to the data. And so we built out the member profiles so that we could give you some data back that says, thank you for taking the survey. And now you have some data in hand. And then we also found that people responded saying, hey, this is great because now I'm applying for a grant and my funder is asking me about our partnerships, and we're able to use this data in our application. So we know that when we build the capacity of each individual organization, it actually makes a stronger whole system. So we were really excited about that, but we've also seen organizations, put that in an annual report or even on their website. And so having data, I think that goes back. And last thing I'll just say is at Visible Network Labs, we really believe in the democratization of data, and that if we take data from community, we should find as many ways as possible to give it back. So that's one of our mechanisms for giving data, pushing data back out into the community. And we have a few others, which I think you'll continue to see more of.
Awesome. Thank you. And I will share a little bit more about how Keeping Forest specifically is building on that as well. But what I would like to do is for everyone, whether or not you were part of the original analysis or not, we do have this dashboard. I did send it out in our newsletter for those of you that are on our newsletter yesterday, but I want to point you to it here. I'll pull it up in just 1 second, and I will get some resources out to you after the webinar so that you have it and can bookmark it there. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just walk you through a little bit, because for someone who's never seen this data before, it might be a little bit overwhelming. So these are the highlights really of what we've been working on, the things that we felt like would be most useful to the community at large. And so as you move through this, I do want to point you to that there is the executive summary. So if you're looking for what are the big takeaways, this is where you can find it. Obviously, you guys can read this so that I don't need to explain it to you. But I do want to point to one thing that isn't immediately obvious, which is you can manipulate these maps, right? So if I want to see, okay, 48 is American Forest Foundation, and I get to have all of this data about where their trust, their value is, the degree centrality. So how much are they connected? What's their density to the network? I can start to see their connections if I was patient enough to say, okay, where does this link? But you can start to pull these apart so that you can understand who's connected to whom. And then there is an actual list of all of those organizations so that you know what those numbers mean. Additionally, I look at the map, and for me, Keeping Forests, I look at, okay, where do we not have connections in our geography, or where do we not have connections by sector in our geography? This also might be of interest to you. You cannot move any of those though. So these are a lot of the statistics, but I do want to get down to, once again, actually, I think I skipped over it. Where's the resource? Oh, this is probably what a lot of you are interested in, the resource inventory from the analysis. And so popping over to here, I need to get who's the right contact person for each of these, because in the case of the analysis itself, I don't think that who answered the analysis is necessarily who we want to be sending people to. But you can look at what are each of these organizations able to provide. So for those of you that are trying not to be duplicative in your efforts, or trying to leverage resources, they've already told you what they can and are willing to provide. So I think this is going to be something that's hugely useful for people in your own efforts, and also for Keeping Forests as we look at how to build our strategies. And then again, here for those three activities that we say this is what Keeping Forest does: convening, innovating, and scaling. You get some of this information that you got in the presentation, but once again, this is a map to, if you're looking for who can help me convene, the larger the bubble, the more connections that they have, the larger the node, the more connections that they have. So just making you aware of these things as well, that it's not queryable in some ways, but in other ways it is queryable. So I want to make sure that you guys know that that's there for you, that this is a resource for you, and that we do hope that you use it. And then last, Jenny, can you move to, I hope we'll have a few minutes for questions. Can you move to slide 42, please?
Let me just grab them.
And Jessica, I do see your question. How do keeping forests use these network analysis results to make changes to their networks and be more strategic? Can you give specific examples? I'm about to dive into that. And I will, but I want to first tell you, for those of you that are on the phone, how can you use this? Now that you have a sense of what the dashboard is, these are some ways that I would suggest that you think about it: identifying organizations engaged, their network scores. How can we think about who's missing? What are those community connections that we don't see in here that might be important to either your strategies or keeping forest strategies as a whole? And how do we go about building those, leveraging resources, connecting with organizations who are leading efforts, and then really asking the question of how do we use the network to amplify impact without duplicating efforts? Now, to answer your question, Jessica, about how are we using this, we are just at the start of having this data in hand to be able to use at all. So the first thing that the first place that we have focused, and can you go to the next slide, please, is really starting to define what is our partnership, what is the most valuable structure for our partnership. And this was also from input from partners. I can send out so that I don't have to go through all of the definitions of what each of these words are. Visible Network Labs has a really cool worksheet that helps communities think through, collaboratives think through, how do they actually establish partnerships and what the role is, so that we're not trying to be all things to all people. But this is the first way. How do we think about what our outcomes are? What is our role? For example, knowledge exchange platforms. This is one example of how we are serving in that role of exchanging knowledge. In the strategies, we're thinking about how do we not pull everyone in all at once, but we think about having sort of starts and ends to our projects and engaging people only as needed. And that if Keeping Forest achieves its goal, then we're out. We've been successful, and we no longer need to exist as an entity, because you all have been empowered and are able to move things forward. So that's one way, defining the partnership as a whole. Next slide, please. Again, this is when people come to me and they say, how do I become a partner? And so we've started to actually tease apart what are the levels of partnership, and so that we can really help people to plug into the strategies at the right point and at the right time to bring them in just to the network. For example, as a community partner, just making sure that there are invitations for convening. For example, this year is the first year that we're going to open up our annual meeting to anyone and everyone. And so that's one example of how this has shifted our thinking. Probably the biggest way, and this will be the invite and call to action after this meeting. And so it was sort of the thing I was teasing in the newsletter yesterday, is this implementing partners piece. So what we have noticed, both through the social network analysis and also in launching several pilot projects last year, is that our best work is done when we're coming alongside partners that already have projects in place, where our innovation and our lens towards the larger system can actually make your efforts more successful. So I'll give the example, South Carolina Forestry Commission and their partners came to Keeping Forest. They were working with us on an emerging markets, payment for ecosystem services, water market. And they were looking for some support, and came to the team of partners as well, looking for some support and how do they sort of get the word out on their watershed plan, but also test an idea of having a voluntary payment for ecosystem services water market. And so my response to them was, would you be willing to test and innovate something, test something that hasn't been done before, that's really an innovative approach and is not going to look like your traditional outreach and education campaign? And sort of the brokering between that is, will you bring resources to the table, both financial and human? And so moving forward, what we are really looking at, and I am going to need some time and probably some interaction with Visible Network Labs, is opening up a call for projects that relate to each of our three strategies. So that when, for example, a foundation that I was recently having a conversation with comes to me and says, hey, we're really interested in this, I know who in our network is already working on that I might be able to initiate some conversations with. Or You know, I think there's another really important piece that I've signed a few letters of support for people who are putting in grants. There's a lot of Forest Service money right now floating around, NIFWIF money that's floating around, and partners who are seeing the work that we're doing have come to me for letters of support, really trying to implement things that we're already testing and doing. In some cases, even going to the exact contractors that we were using. There is a much more powerful grant application if I know that four partners throughout the geography are working on the same thing. If Keeping Forest provides that umbrella that then allows those 4 projects, for example, to leverage one another's resources and make sure that they're looking at solutions that the region as a whole can implement. So those are 2 specific ways that we're you know, defining the partnership model as a whole, and then really looking at implementing partners. Those are 2 ways that I'm really excited about how we're moving forward. So does that help to answer your question, Jessica? Hopefully. All right. So with that, we just have a few minutes, but I would love to open it to questions from anyone. And I believe if I can figure it out technologically, that I can actually either give you audio access or perhaps even audio and video access. We'd love to see your face if we can. So just if there are any questions, please type something in the Q&A chat and we can bring you live. Nothing. We solved the problems. Oh. Okay. Well, with that, thank you for your participation today. There is an exit survey that's 2 questions. So if you would just stay and answer those as you sign out. I'm also going to do follow up with a few more questions if you're willing to go a little bit deeper in providing some information. Thank you for your time today. I hope that this was useful to you and will continue to be useful to you. Another really exciting thing that's happening in the next month is that we are launching a completely new website. And Keeping Forest has done a ton of work that hasn't always been really visible or easy to find. And so this new website is going to help you get to those resources quickly and really showcase the work that all of you have been so instrumental in enabling over the last 6 or 7 years. Lastly, we are going to continue to do webinars, hopefully monthly. Next week, we will be releasing a mini documentary on our connection with bourbon and white oak. So June 14th, mark your calendars. Hope you'll join us for that live viewing, and we'll continue to roll those out. Jenny, Danielle, thank you. This has been amazing, and I hope that I get to continue to work with you. You are both brilliant in your own right and are really helping to strengthen this community. So could not be here without you, and you've given a lot of to Jessica's question about how are we using this work to move forward. You've given me so much information, in our community so much information that can just make it better. So thank you so much for your time today and with us as a partnership.
Thank you.
Okay, you'll hear from me soon. Thank you guys. Have a great day.